to you. Continue moving among us. Help us as we continue to worship today. In Jesus' name, amen. I used to think that when someone did something to us that we took offense at, that we were upset about, that it was sort of a flat thing in the sense that it doesn't matter if they did a small thing or a big thing, our response should always be the same. It should be instantly to forgive them and move on. Except that the way human nature is, we are rarely able to do that. And what I have found liberating almost in doing some reading around, particularly from this book I've been referring to, from Bill Hybels' book, is a freedom in recognizing that maybe our responses to different sorts of offenses, the different sorts of things that we bump into in our lives, that having different responses actually may be quite helpful. So, and the reality is that always our responses are going to include something about forgiveness, eventually, hopefully. But the reality is that forgiveness is hard work. And how we put that together in our life is not necessarily straightforward. So last week, 2 weeks ago, we looked at how God forgives us. Last week, we talked about one way that we're involved in forgiving others. We talked about what was called a Category 1 sort of situation that's like a little tiny roadblock or a speed bump that isn't a big deal. And we talked about the way to respond is probably to fairly quickly forgive and then forget and then move on. One of the things I probably didn't say very clearly is that I think that oftentimes that forgiving and forgetting and moving on doesn't even involve the other person. It involves a conversation between us and God. Because sometimes people have done something that we're taking offense at, but when we take a step back, we realize it's really not a big deal. And it doesn't actually make sense to go to the person and explain to them what they did wrong that offended us so that we could turn around and forgive them. It may, but it may not. And our response in a case like that may be simply a conversation with God about forgiving and then forgetting and moving on. Now, as an example, I live with someone who has made it very clear to me that I need to make sure that the dishes get in the dishwasher. But she sometimes puts the dishes in the sink. And sometimes that's really frustrating because then I come along to fill a container of water and I can't get the container in the sink because there's all sorts of other stuff in the sink. And I've got a number of choices that I can make at that point. I can simply put the dishes in the dishwasher and just forgive, forget, and move on. Now, sometimes it's worth talking to a person about something like that after you've forgiven and moved on, to then be able to say, look, we got to live together here and maybe we can do something different. And there's a tone and a way we can do that. I have been absolutely amazed, and this is not only at home, but it's amongst the church here, how many times people have made a big deal out of someone doing something once. I mean, I get it when it's a pattern, and we keep bumping into it over and over again, and we keep forgetting and forgiving and moving on, but the forgetting part's getting harder and harder because it's the same thing happening over and over again, and maybe we need to address it. Fair enough. But I'm amazed at the number of people who get really wound up when something happens once. A small, inconsequential thing happens once, and they want to have a big discussion about it. Like, I think we need to have a bit of perspective and just say, it happened once. Maybe the person was distracted today. Maybe they had a bad night's sleep. Who knows what? We just forgive, we forget, and we move on. But there is another choice. And that is to not forgive, to let it build up inside of us, and then the next time they do, something builds up more, and then it builds up more, and then it builds up more, and then eventually it blows up. My suggestion is that there's a better way than that, and that involves just forgiving, forgetting, and moving on the small speed bumps of life. Those are the sorts of things that happen day after day after day. It's constant. And if we let it build up, we are going to blow up. We really do need to let it go. But there are other things that do happen to us that aren't in that category. We sang about, and we talked about forgiveness. I want us to take a look at the 12 steps of AA. This is a process. I want us to take. We're going to go through all 12 steps, and I just want to take a look. Have you take a look at it from the perspective of forgiveness? Which of these steps are necessary steps in the process of forgiveness? So let's think about it from that angle. So we admit that we're powerless over alcohol or whatever else it is that's causing us a lot of grief, and our lives have become unmanageable. We came to believe that a power greater than ourselves can restore us to sanity. Hence, we're in the conversation with God. We've made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understand Him. We've made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. We admit to God and ourselves and to one other person the exact nature of our wrongs. And we're ready to have God actually change us and our nature, our character. We're ready to have God remove those defects. We actually ask God to remove those defects of our character. We make a list of the people that we've harmed and become willing to make amends to them. And we actually do that. Go to the people, unless it's going to actually harm them, we go to them and let them know what we've done wrong and seek forgiveness. Continue to take a personal inventory, and when we're wrong, to admit it. To seek through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God. And finally, having had this sort of spiritual awakening, we are prepared to talk to other people about it. That last step is quite interesting, because if you talk to someone who's involved in AA, they're quite willing to do step number 12. And those of us who've experienced God in other ways are so reluctant to do step 12. It's interesting. So, of those 12 steps, which ones, in your reflection, do you think have something to do with the process of forgiveness? Sorry? Well, perhaps all of them, but some of them are more specifically targeted. I mean, I just found this really interesting, looking at it. CJ had suggested I should do this, looking at it from the perspective of forgiveness. Okay, we need to see them again. People's memories aren't as good as mine, having read it lots. Okay, specifically targeted to forgiveness. Any of these guys? Recognizing that there's something there, but it's not necessarily taking the next step. But yeah, okay. John? Okay. John?
Recognizing our powerlessness to forgive.
Okay. Recognizing our powerlessness has got something that... Okay. 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 These ones. Sorry? Yeah? Yep. We're starting to look at ourselves and say, where have I failed? Where's my moral compass gone off? Because until we can seek forgiveness from others, that's the first step.
Five was the knowledge.
Yep.
What we recognize is.
Yep. What I was putting down was from 4 through to 10. All were involved in the process of forgiveness. Now, you guys have actually enlarged it a little bit. But can we go back to the one? Got to make you work up there, Laverne. Gets too boring otherwise. So doing a moral search for ourselves, admitting to God and ourselves and to someone else that we failed. I mean, until we can admit that we failed, we're not going to be able to ask for forgiveness. That we're ready to ask God that we can actually change, and recognizing that we need to change. Asking God to actually do that change, not just admitting we need to, but asking for that to happen. Starting to make a list of people that we have offended against. Laverne, if you can, yeah.
They all sort of follow three themes. One is, this is bigger than me.
Yep.
I need God to help me with it, and there are specific things I need to do to make things right.
Right.
Those are kind of the three.
Yep. Very much so. Very much so. It struck me that well over half, depending on how you work at it, have something to do with this process that is exactly recognizing that I really don't have control anymore. This is bigger than I can deal with. That, I'm trying to remember what the three were there, Cam. The second one,
God's help, and there are things I need to do.
and there's things I need to do about it. That I need to take responsibility. I need to take some action. Over half of them. I had 7 out of 12. By the way we were talking, we were adding a couple of others in. You know, it struck me that 7, 8, 9 out of 12 of what the AA process is about, of coming to healing, has to do with this larger process of seeking forgiveness. I was truly astounded when I saw that. And so there's two sides to that seeking forgiveness. Part of it is taking responsibility. I messed up. I'm responsible. I need to move forward and seek some sort of reconciliation with the people around me. Now, what we're actually talking about is the flip side of this. But to recognize that's a huge part of the process of healing for someone who's suffering with an addiction. I was, again, just really surprised. But we're actually looking a little bit at the flip side of that. So when we have felt wronged, when someone has wronged us, how do we respond? And the reality is for the AA person going around and doing this sort of stuff, this is bigger than a speed bump. These people have betrayed people in some fairly significant way. They have caused lasting hurt to people that really they cared about, to their families, to people they've married, to their kids, like whatever it is. They've caused lasting difficulties. That's the sort of stuff that Bill Hybels talks about as a category 2. This is something where people have been legitimately hurt, legitimately injured. Now, sometimes we feel that we've been legitimately injured, that someone has done something that has really hurt us. And sometimes, with the help of someone near us, we can step back and we realize that, you know what, that was actually a speed bump. It was a big speed bump, but it was still a speed bump. And I just need to deal with it. Maybe it's a bit more of a process than simply forgiving, forgetting, and moving on, but it's in that sort of category. But, you know, my thinking has got muddled. But sometimes we step back and realize that it's not like that, that this really is a bigger deal. That the hurt really is substantial. And you know, oftentimes for people, the response is they want to get even. They want to get revenge. We've got this really good word for it. They want justice, which usually has nothing to do with justice. The thing that I think that we need to be cautious of when we get ourselves in situations like this, because we all do sooner or later, the speed bumps we encounter on a regular basis all through our lives. But these things all of us encounter, but hopefully not on a regular basis. But our temptation is not necessarily to have a good, healthy response. Our temptation is often to do stuff that is particularly not helpful. But the thing for us to remember is that we always have a choice. We are always responsible for our actions. We can't predict, we can't we're not responsible for the action of people against us that we have taken offense about, but we always have responsibility for our own actions. We always have choice on our own actions. And if we get ourselves into a situation where we say, we don't have a choice, we have to get revenge, or maybe we're being much better about it, I don't have a choice, I have to get justice. Well, then we're in the same position as the alcoholic who is at the bottom of their life because they're saying, I don't have control anymore, and they have to turn it over to God, and we're in a very unhealthy spot. But the reality is, we always have a choice. In the text that Greta read from Ephesians, and I'm not going to remember the exact wording from the version she used, and it's okay. I think it's often helpful for us to hear more than one version and more than one set of words because they can often work together and reinforce each other. But Paul says that we need to speak the truth to one another because we belong to each other. We're part of the same group. Now, he's specifically talking to the church. But the reality is, if we take a look at what he says and we take a look at the example of Jesus, we realize that these words are not merely to how we should function with one another within the context of the church, but also how we function with each other in the world. Paul says, be angry. He recognizes that sooner or later we're going to get angry. But then he says we have a choice about what we're going to do with that anger. And that as Christians, we need to make sure that our anger doesn't result in sin. We need to make sure that our anger doesn't result in creating a space between us and the other person, or even within ourselves, that allows room for the devil to move in and cause lasting damage. Paul wrote to the church in Ephesus and said, we are people and we have a choice. How you respond reflects on your character. And because a central part of your character is that you are a follower of Jesus and that you are trying to become every day more and more like Jesus was, how you respond reflects on your character, on how you are on that road in following. So he continues in that text and talks more about what it means to be part of that character, of your character, what it means to be a follower of Jesus, what it means deep down. And so in the text I was reading, it says, put away bitterness, wrath, anger, slander, malice. All the sorts of things that you build up in your heart when you're after revenge.
Could we add to that your convictions of right and wrong?
I'd have to think more about that. I think that there might be, I think sometimes we carry convictions of right and wrong, and particularly when I've been wronged, we carry that in, and we make that something much bigger than what it should be. And we don't live with grace in our lives.
Just thinking of changing world,
Yeah.
your perception.
Yeah. So we need to be careful about what we have experienced as right and wrong, and are they my cultural, my upbringing right and wrong, or are they really right and wrongs? And I think it's one of the powerful things about being in having lived and experienced different cultures, is that sometimes it becomes more obvious what is cultural and sort of what I grew up with, as opposed to what Jesus or God are saying. This really is essential right and wrong. One of the things I think that Paul is also saying, though, is we need to put on kindness and tenderness. It was interesting. I don't know, Greta, if you can see from your translation there how it translated, the kindness and tenderness. I know it's a little bit maybe hard to find it. It's getting towards the end.
Yeah, without knowing which verse it is.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. Sorry?
32?
32?
Okay, so then it's 31. The message kind of puts
I know,
things together.
I know.
So make a clean break from all cutting, backbiting, gloating.
Right.
Be gentle with one another and sensitive.
So be gentle and sensitive. Okay? And what I was reading is be kind and tender-hearted. And it's interesting that, I think it's interesting that lots of times Paul gives a list of very concrete things, and it was tender-hearted, or what was the word there?
Gentle and sensitive.
Sensitive. It doesn't sound like a Paul sort of word. Paul, my experience in reading of Paul is that he'd be interesting to get to know from a distance, but up close he might be kind of tender-hearted and sensitive aren't on the top of the list. But and sometimes when we preach and when we write, we are also speaking to ourselves. So, which is the case for some of the stuff today, for sure. And then he says, forgiving one another as Jesus forgave us, as Christ forgave us. So making sure that our lives are, what we're doing, are connected to what Jesus has done for us. Which is why we started the 3 weeks with talking about the forgiveness of Jesus for us. So, it is possible. We will undoubtedly, sooner or later, find ourselves in this situation where we are legitimately wronged. We feel betrayed. That someone who is close to us has done something that has deeply hurt us. And it's just a very difficult spot to be in. But we need to remember that we always have a choice. We are always responsible for our actions. And as Christians who are growing into the character more and more, a character that is based on being like Jesus, it can't be about getting revenge. It can only be about grace, mercy, forgiveness. Ultimately, that's the only way that we're going to be able to bring healing to ourselves, maybe healing to the relationship. But if we aren't able to live with grace and mercy and forgiveness and live a life that is based on that, we are just going to end up with the stuff in our lives building up more and more and more, and eventually blowing up. So forgiveness is part of any real healing. And revenge or justice isn't going to produce any lasting satisfaction. As much as we may think it does and hope it does, it simply doesn't. So if you feel wronged, betrayed, or if you're walking through life with someone who is feeling that, one way or another, eventually you're going to need to talk about forgiveness. And for us as Christians, on this journey in life, part of the reason that we forgive is because we have been forgiven. Now, the reality is that sometimes, hopefully never, but it happens sometimes, that there is something yet bigger, an injustice that is far bigger than the sorts of things that we have been talking about. Something that has happened to you, again, hopefully not, and for lots of people it may not ever be a factor, but where something is just huge. So it could be the death of a child. Now, probably not the death, but the killing of a child. Or perhaps a spouse who has betrayed you and the marriage has fallen apart. Or something that is not just, a big deal in life, but is absolutely life-shattering. And what we do, I think, in a case like this is going to be different because the level of pain is different. Now, you may have noticed on the bulletin cover and on our webpage that there is a picture there that, if you were at the webpage, you might have read it. Laverne, there should be a picture in front of you that you can throw up there of Coventry Cathedral. Yeah. It's one of the altars of Coventry Cathedral. The cross there is, well, at least the original one, was made of a charred piece of Coventry Cathedral that was destroyed in Second World War. So Coventry Cathedral was a cathedral that was built in the Middle Ages and was destroyed in the war one night in November. And when the people of Coventry got together to try and figure out what to do next, they started asking not just what should we do in terms of the building, but what should we do in terms of the nature of the church that we want to grow out of this. So part of it was they took that cross, and they also, I don't know if you can read it, but behind the cross it says, Father, forgive, the prayer that Jesus said on the cross. But they also decided to dedicate the church, the new church that they were going to build, to forgiveness and to reconciliation. And it's interesting that even now, Coventry, the whole town apparently, but that's centered through the cathedral, is developed into an international. It's developed a significant international reputation as one of Europe's major centers of peace and reconciliation. And I think that this is interesting, partly because it comes from Wikipedia, which isn't, always the best source for Christian anything. But it says, there continues to be a strong influence of reconciliation within the theology of Coventry Cathedral. And then it says in brackets, both vertically reconciling people to God and horizontally reconciling individuals and groups. And still on the staff, one of the key staff positions is a person involved in reconciliation. They've got a center of reconciliation. They've done a bunch of stuff. But you got to think, this happened. Well, a couple of other things that I thought were fascinating. The old cathedral had some really long bolts or nails or something that were holding the roof on. And they took some of these and welded them into crosses. And there's one of them in Coventry Cathedral. But there's also one in Dresden that they made. And there's one in whatever Leningrad, the new name for Leningrad is. The cities that they have partnered with and stuff. So they're trying to build bridges with people that they would have been struggling with, particularly during the war. There were some interesting choices that they made, because this had to be painful. First of all, it was the center of town, but the war was a very painful thing if anyone has talked to folks who've lived through it, even if they haven't fought, and if they fought in it, they lost all sorts of people. We've seen lots of things recently in the newspaper around Remembrance Day. The whole thing was painful, and that's stuff, reading in the paper, it's stuff from people from here, let alone people who were there, were, an incredible number of the young men from Coventry would have been involved in the war. Huge amounts of pain and what they were able to do with it. The thing is, when something is that big, when something, it touches us that deeply and involves that amount of pain, we can't quickly move on, I don't think. I think we have to take some time to recognize what happened. I think we need to take some time to recognize what it is that we have lost, that we have permanently lost. To recognize the pain that we will carry with us forever. And perhaps even to recognize some of the anger that we're living with right now. It's a deeper process than it would be for any of the other things I was talking about. But we always have a choice. We don't have a choice about what happened to us, but we have a choice about how we are going to respond. What is our character like? Is our character connected to the character of Jesus? And then we need to say, if it is, we need to remember the prayer that Jesus prayed on the cross to the people who were physically killing him. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. But the thing is, we're not Jesus. And it takes us a lot longer to get to the point that Jesus was able to get to while he was on the cross. And so it may take us some time. It will likely take us some time. Because we need to be able to work through it. If we haven't got to the point of realizing what the cost is to us, what the pain is to us, we're not actually able to forgive what's happened. But the other reality is that forgiveness is the only route to healing. Revenge isn't going to get there. No matter how much we might desire it, no matter how much we would hope that it could do something, it won't. Revenge simply won't get us there to healing. So if this is a situation that you end up by finding yourself in, or if it's a situation that you end up by finding yourself walking beside someone else, part of what has to happen is we have to give them time. And one of the sins of the church, I think, is often been in times when there has been an offense within the church. The stories I'm most familiar with are around sexual abuse. That the church quickly goes and tries to pressure the person who was offended, the victim, into offering forgiveness when they can't. We need to be able to let them do some healing, let them do some looking inside before they're going to be able to even consider that as an option. Now, we may know that it's the only way to true healing, although I think oftentimes for the church it's been a matter of trying to cover up rather than trying to be responsible. But we may know that it's the only way of truly healing, but you can't get there until you've realized the cost and what you're saying. But we've seen some incredible examples of people who've been able to do that. I suspect some of you have read about or listened to Wilma Dirksen talk about her journey. Her daughter Candace was killed in Winnipeg 30 years ago, something like that. And the journey that she and her husband, but she's the one who does the talking, have gone through in the process of working with themselves and the anger they had and the hurt and ultimately the forgiveness. Or the Amish in Pennsylvania when someone went in and shot up a bunch of folks there. Or the people of Coventry, where forgiveness is part of their journey towards healing and where they've ended up by becoming a center of some of that healing. In the end, always, healing involves forgiveness. Forgiveness between us and God, forgiveness between us and the people around us, even forgiveness of ourselves. Because we are typically much more conscious of how badly we've messed up than the people around us even. And it's when we take a serious look at ourselves, we may need to be able to find room to give ourselves some grace. So let us go as a people who have received great forgiveness from God and from one another as we live together in community. Let us go into the world and offer that forgiveness from our hearts to the people around us. Let us live lives of mercy and grace. Let's pray. Lord, you have forgiven us and invite us on the journey to live lives of forgiveness of the folks around us. Help us to do that. Help us to live lives of mercy and grace and forgiveness, even when our first instinct is to do the opposite. Help us to walk with your grace. In Jesus' name, amen.